If you have a small home studio or maybe even a bedroom studio and not a lot of space, but would like to get into Dolby Atmos, you might have wondered how you can actually monitor immersive audio in a space that isn't really capable of holding a full Dolby Atmos setup with all its 12 speakers. And the answer to that question is simply by using a head tracker. Now, I've done a lot of head tracking videos over the past, and 2 weeks ago I actually showed you how you can use the Apple AirPods natively in Logic Pro in order to monitor immersive audio. I'm going to leave a link to that video in the description below, and some of you have actually reached out to me asking if there's a similar thing possible for Cubase and or Nuendo. And the answer to the question is yes, there is. You can actually use a head tracker natively with Cubase and or Nuendo, and today I'm going to show you how you can do that. This is going to be the cheapest and least complicated way to monitor immersive audio in Cubase and or Nuendo, and therefore a very good option in case you have maybe not the space or not the financial means to set up a full Dolby Atmos studio. So let's get started. But first of all, hello everybody. In case you're new here, my name is Michael Wagner. I teach at the Antoinette Westphal College of Media Arts and Design at Drexel University in Philadelphia. And on this channel, I talk about digital media, game design, and spatial audio. And if any of those topics interest you, I invite you to subscribe or join my Discord community. In that link is in the description below. And since you're already at it, also please don't forget to press the like button. It really helps out the channel and makes my video available to other people. I'd really appreciate that. And with that being said, let's get started with monitoring immersive audio in Cubase. What I've done for this video today is that I've taken a couple of loops from a production that I'm currently working on and converted that into Dolby Atmos. Now, in full disclosure, this is essentially a production that I'm doing in stereo, so not everything works perfectly fine in Dolby Atmos, but it's good enough for what we're doing today. And let's first have a brief listen on these couple of bars, and then I'm going to show you how everything is set up so that we have an understanding of what we're actually working with. So let's have a brief listen. So this is essentially the loop that we're working with. So what I have here are 5 individual tracks. These 5 tracks are routed into the Dolby Atmos renderer as objects, so they come out as 10 individual objects. And for the bed, what I've done is I've essentially kind of taken all these individual tracks, routed them into the bed, which is a 7.1.2 bed, and in the bed I have a reverb, so the reverb is essentially completely immersive, whereas the individual tracks are all objects. Now, if you're unfamiliar with how to set up a Dolby Atmos project in Cubase, I did a video a while back, and I'm going to post a link in the description below that essentially shows you how to do that. But let's just go briefly through all the individual steps that I had to take. Well, first of all, you need to make sure that you have a Dolby Atmos bed, which is in general a 7.1.2 track, and then kind of you use a bus track, which is a 7.1.4 track. On the bus track, you need the Dolby Atmos renderer, and I'm just opening that up here, the Dolby Atmos renderer. And as you can see, the Dolby Atmos renderer recognizes the 10 individual objects that are coming from this 5 stereo pairs and then the bed. Now, in order to make sure that the routing is let me just get that out of the way here. To make sure that the routing is done correctly, what you need to do is you need to go into the project settings, into the ADM authoring for Dolby Atmos, and here you essentially need to select the renderer. If you're in Cubase, you only have the option of an internal renderer. For this particular video, I'm going to use the internal renderer, and then you essentially need to add the bed as a bed, and then essentially the individual objects, and you can add that here. And that's really everything that you need to do in order to get things started. Now, once you've set up all the individual objects and the bed, obviously the next step is to kind of move things around a little in 3-dimensional space in order to take advantage of the fully immersive nature that Dolby Atmos can give you. Let's just have a brief listen of what I did here. I essentially just kind of made a couple of adjustments to the individual positions of these objects. I think the easiest way is if we want to once again kind of open up the renderer and just play that a little, and then essentially we see in the renderer where all these objects are. and how they come into play. So there are a couple of objects in the back, there are a couple of objects in the front, there are a couple of objects on top, and there are a couple of objects on the bottom, just to make sure that I have essentially action on all individual tracks and all individual object tracks here in the Dolby Atmos renderer. Now, if you want to monitor that fully immersively, obviously the best way to do that is by setting up a full Dolby Atmos studio with 12 speakers. But that can be fairly expensive. You know, even if you go the cheapest route, you still need 12 really good speakers, and then you also need an audio interface that can essentially address all those 12 speakers. So I think the cheapest you can probably get away with is around $5,000–6,000. That's about what you probably need. And for most of you who are out there kind of just playing around with things or just having this as a hobby, this might not be a possibility also, or you might not even have the space to do that. So the next best option obviously is to use head tracking, and by head tracking I mean that I'm using headphones and I'm having Cubase present the audio to me into my headphones in exactly the same way I would hear them when I would be in a 12-speaker studio setup, and that essentially means that Cubase needs to know the position of my head, in which direction I'm looking, so that it can give me the correct impression into my headphones. Now, I've done a couple of videos on how to do that, usually with the help of certain plugins. What I'm going to do today is I'm actually going to show you how you can use the native capabilities of Cubase and Nuendo in order to do that with essentially no plugin whatsoever, just kind of natively, in the very same way Logic Pro works natively with AirPods. In order to access the head tracking settings of Cubase and or Nuendo, what you need to do is you need to go into the studio settings, and under studio settings you have an option that kind of specifies head tracking. Now, once again, I'm sometimes getting this question. This only obviously works for Cubase Professional, so if you have one of the lesser versions of Cubase, you don't have access to that. So you need at least the Pro version of Cubase and or Nuendo, and then you have that option. Now, if you open that up, there are a couple of different possibilities on what you can do for the tracking source. Now, standard way is that it's set manual, and that essentially means that I can change yaw, pitch, and roll, so yaw, pitch, and roll kind of manually by kind of turning those knobs. But you can specify certain tracking sources, and one of the tracking sources that you can use, for example, is a regular VR controller. There are a couple of different options, really. You can use OpenVR, you can use a space mouse, and I've actually done that myself for some time. It's actually quite fun. It's not as easy as a regular tracking device, but it actually works. Or you can use the option that is an OSC server. Now, here is the thing that is a little bit unfortunate, let's call it that way. This option has been in Cubase for actually quite some time, but for whatever reason, this option is completely undocumented. And by completely undocumented, I mean completely undocumented. There have actually people been reaching out to Steinberg, asking Steinberg to tell them how to actually do that, and Steinberg even couldn't tell them. So there was no information out there, and people were wondering how you can actually do that. Now, almost in true crime fashion, there were a couple of people, though, that kept kind of trying to figure out how to actually make that work. And at some point, somebody figured out that Cubase is actually listening to port 7000. But that didn't really help, and then somebody noticed that there is a DLL in the Windows version of Cubase that keeps all the information, and unfortunately though, that was hard coded into the system and you couldn't really kind of get the information out of there easily. And then Ben Zappa is the developer of the Zapoware head tracker, and we're actually going to use that today, managed to reverse engineer the DLL and try to and figured out essentially how that works and what we have to do in order to address that option in Cubase. And this is what we're going to do today. Now, I'm going to leave a link to Ben's post on the Steinberg forums so that you can look it up and figure out for yourself essentially what you actually need to do in order to address Cubase through an OSC server. What I'm going to do today is I'm in honor of Ben Zappa, who kind of did the unthinkable and reverse engineered the DLL. I'm going to use his head tracker. Also because, quite frankly, it's one of the nicest head tracker there is. And Ben Zappa actually implemented that in his software. So you don't have to do anything of any particular complicated nature. feature. So you can simply use this head tracker and it will actually work natively with Cubase. And this is what we're going to do today. Now I'm going to do a follow-up video where I'm going to show you how you can actually use what Ben found out in order to make the Cubase work with the Waves NX head tracker and also the Apple AirPods. This video is most likely going to come next week, but once again, in honor of Ben Zappa, we are going to work with Ben's head tracker today. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to open up the software that comes with the Zappa head tracker, and this software is called Bridgehead. So let's open that up, and here we are. After we've done that, we need to connect the head tracker to our computer. So let me just do that here. And as soon as I've connected that, it will actually show up here. And I will already be able to track my head. So if I'm moving the head tracker, essentially I have the position of the head here. The dummy head that kind of shows me which direction I'm looking. If I'm double clicking on that, it essentially kind of resets. You sometimes need to do that simply because the head tracker sometimes drifts a little. So once in a while, you actually need to do the reset that manually. Now, what we have to do in order to make this work with Nuendo and or Cubase, there are really a couple of things that you need to do. First of all, you might want to go into the head tracker settings and make sure that you have set everything correctly. And in particular, we want to make sure that we have the direction or the chirality of the head tracker, because this is one that you essentially can put on in such a way that the cable is on the left side or that the cable is on the right side. I'm going to use it such that the cable is on the left. That is essentially make sure that you have set that up correctly. And then we need to go into the bridge settings. And in the bridge settings, we need to select the Nuendo profile. And the Nuendo profile will essentially make sure that it communicates the information in exactly the way Nuendo expects it to. So let's just kind of select that. I've already pre-selected it. We here sort of see what type of information is sent out. Essentially, it is sending out on port 7000 and it's using what's called head pose. And I'm going to go a little bit more into specifics in next week's video, but in this video, I just want to make sure that you kind of see how easy it is to set that up actually. Now, in terms of the tracking rate, there's something very unique about the way Nuendo and or Cubase works. We need to actually use the lowest tracking rate, and that is because Nuendo and or Cubase are easily overwhelmed by the data that is coming from the head tracker. So if you're tracking it with a too high of a frequency, Nuendo and or Cubase will need some time to actually catch up, and you won't get a full real-time experience. So you need to make sure that you're not kind of sending it out more often than 25 times a second. That's really what you need to make sure. And once again, this is going to become an issue next week when we're talking about how to do the same thing with the Waves NX head tracker. And that's really everything that we need to do. So we now have the bridgehead selected, and let's go back into the studio settings and here into head tracking. I've already selected the OSC server, and all I now need to do is I need to enable tracking. And as soon as I've enabled tracking, I can see that the head tracker is now communicating to the head tracking information in our digital audio workstation, and we now can use the head tracker natively with Cubase. So this is everything we needed to set up. So let's get started and let's do something with it. Before I can do anything meaningful with it, the first thing I need to do is I need to connect the head tracker to my headphones. I've already done that here. The nice thing about the Zappa head tracker is that if you have headphones that essentially allow you to take off the headband, you can actually kind of position that within the headband. So I'm using the Biodynamic DT990 Pro here, and they allow me to essentially take off that headband. Here we are, and sort of that allows me to kind of put that head tracker inside the headphones, and they become very inobtrusive. So let's make use of that head tracking information within Cubase. And the one thing you need to understand is that we cannot really use that head tracking information directly with our 7.1.4 Dolby Atmos bus, because the head tracking information is only available with is only usable with the Ambi decoder. So what we need to do is we need to convert the Atmos bus first into an Ambisonics track, and then we can essentially decode the Ambisonics track with the Ambi decoder and use the head tracking information in order to decode it according to the direction I'm looking at. So let's add an Ambisonics track. Now you could also use the control room for that purpose, but as I've pointed out a couple of times, I generally don't like to use the control room simply because I'm changing the studio setup so often, and whatever you put into the control room is essentially more or less permanent, and that has screwed me up a couple of times. So sometimes I had put stuff into the control room and then completely forgot about it, and when I created a new project, I was confused what was actually going on. So I've started to actually not use the control room, but if you have a fairly permanent setup, then by all means, please use the control room. I'm going to simply add an Ambisonics group track. That's what I'm going to do here. So let's add an Ambisonics track under more. Let's go to third order Ambisonics, and let's do the outputs. Let's do the stereo out, and let's add that, and let's give it a name. Let's call it Ambisonics. And let's add the track. And then what we need to do is we need to route the Atmos bus into our Ambisonics track. So let's route that. So instead to the stereo out, we want it to be routed into the Ambisonics track. So the last thing we need to do is we need to open up the panning device in our Ambisonics track. So let's open it up here. And the only thing we really need to do is we need to enable head tracking here, and that's all there is to it. And that will essentially give me the head tracking information. So with the head tracking enabled, so let's have a brief listen on how that actually sounds. Now, once again, I'm going to pipe the audio that I'm hearing in my headphones directly into your speakers. So when I'm moving the head, you will most likely hear that as a panning in your speakers, but it sort of gives you some impression essentially how well it works and how reactive it really is to my head position. So let's just start that. I might kind of reset the head for another time. So let's do that, and let's start. And if I'm moving the head, essentially, the ARP and the bass are essentially in front of me, everything else is sort of in the back, and that gives me a fairly good impression. Now, the one thing I need to mention is that I get a little bit annoyed by the way the panning device of the Ambisonics bus works, and that is essentially because it insists on showing me my head position here. And I find that a little bit confusing, and I also didn't really find a way to turn it off. So if that kind of bothers you, just ignore it. But it is a little kind of counterintuitive, because as I'm moving my head to the left, it's sort of the sound is moving into the wrong direction. It kind of doesn't really make it's not completely intuitive, at least not to me. Some of you have pointed out in previous videos that you don't really like the way it sounds when Cubase converts multi-channel audio into Ambisonics. That has to do with the way the encoder works in Cubase and or Ambisonics. If that's the case, you can replace that with another encoder of your liking, something that you find kind of sounds good to you. Now, there are really two that I can recommend, and one is the Novonode's 3DX encoder that can be used as a panner in Cubase, and the other one is Sound Particle Space Controller, the studio version. And let me just briefly show you how that works and how that actually sounds. So all you really need to do is you need to go into the panning settings here. So right click here and change the channel panner either to 3DX or to the space controller. So let's first change that to 3DX. As soon as we've done that, we double click in it to open it. And with the space controller 3DX, what you need to do is you need to specify what the input and output configurations are. So the input configuration here is a 7.1.4. Where are we here? 7.1.4. And the output is essentially third order Ambisonics. It's way at the bottom here. And as soon as I've done that, essentially I hear the same sound through the 3DX encoder. And that's actually an encoder I personally like quite a bit. It sounds quite good, and kind of if that's something that you have, it's certainly worthwhile kind of trying out if that's better for your ears and if that's something that you prefer. Now, the other option obviously is the space controller from Sound Particle. So let's just switch to that one. So here we have the space controller. Once again, that needs to be the standard version. So you can't really use the kind of the simple version, the light version. Now this one automatically recognizes what it needs to do. So it recognizes that the input is a 7.1.4 and the output is third order. So let's just have a brief listen on how that one sounds. And I might need to reset the head. One thing I've never really talked about when it comes to the space controller from sound particles is the fact that in this particular encoder, you can actually change the position of each channel individually. So what you can do is you can go into the channel mode. And in the channel mode, you have access to the position of each speaker individually. So you can simply take a speaker and can move it around into a different position. And that might be useful, for example, if you want to create a little bit more distance to, for example, if you're working for a movie and you want to create a little bit more distance to the actual movie screen, you can do that by moving the left-right speakers essentially a little bit to the back, and you can play around with that. That is a nice feature. And to be perfectly honest, there are a couple of features that the sound particles plugins have that are rarely talked about. One thing that not a lot of people really know is that the plugins from sound particles are all Atmos capable, and I actually might make a different video where I'm going to talk about that. So if you're using the energy panel or the brightness panel, there's a plugins from sound particles. Those are actually Atmos capable, and we can use them in an Atmos setting. And that is one of those nice features. So once again, if you don't like the encoder that comes with Cubase and Nuendo, just switch it out to a 3DX or kind of the sound particle space controller. And there are others as well. And choose whatever you find is appropriate. Now, this is really everything I wanted to say today. Thanks again for watching. And if you have any comments or questions, please use the comment section below, or once again, join my Discord community. Invite link is in the description below. And what I'm going to do next week is I'm going to actually create a follow-up video where we're going to use this information that Ben Zappa found in communicating with Nuendo, and we're going to use that in order to enable native head tracking with the Waves NX head tracker and the Apple AirPods. And that's going to be real fun. It will require us to do a little bit of scripting. It's not particularly complicated, but it's a little bit more involved than what we did today. And but that's going to come next week. And with that being said, see you at the next video.